So today on the Firestone Files, we'll discuss the philosophy behind thinking. I'll share a few personal stories to illustrate its power and draw practical lessons for living a more meaningful life. Welcome back, everyone, to the Firestone Files. I'm Dr. Chris Firestone. Today, we're going to be talking about thinking. Have you ever driven a long distance and not remembered how you got there? I drive from Chicago down to Arkansas about at least once a year, sometimes multiple times. And there are long stretches of time. If I don't have music on, or if I'm just kind of vegetating while I'm driving, where I can't remember how I got 100 miles down the road. Have you ever been so absorbed in a mundane task like cleaning out your garage or maybe doing a jigsaw puzzle and the hours just slipped away? Many of us experience moments where time passes without conscious thought or conscious awareness, like you're going through life on autopilot. Today, we explore the question, how can thinking enhance your life? And not just thinking, but sort of a conscious, aware sort of thinking. This intentional thinking can transform routine moments or even special moments into meaningful experiences. So today on the Firestone Files, we'll discuss the philosophy behind thinking. I'll share a few personal stories to illustrate its power and draw practical lessons for living a more meaningful life. As a philosopher, contemplation over the meaning of life, the meaning of our individual experiences is pretty commonplace. We observe the world, we reflect on sensations, we observe our reactions to things and how to react better. But when we think about a philosopher, oftentimes we think of hair splitting, analyzing everything so deeply, it can seem impractical. So we don't really develop the skill, if you will, of careful critical thinking on a regular basis. Oh, we do so when we have difficult times or when situation calls for it. I know if you're investing money, for example, you'll carefully consider the various options and, never perfectly, but with some fear and trepidation, maybe you'll make an investment and then watch it go up and down and realize you didn't know as much as you thought you knew, and then you go back at it again and get a little better at it next time and so forth. So we do. I'm not saying people don't use critical thinking, but we don't go about life, generally speaking, I would suggest, exercising that kind of conscious, aware thinking that I'm going to be advocating for here today. In philosophy, there are kind of two realms in which thinking is primary. There's the theoretical realm, contemplating experiences and their meaning. You observe the world, you reflect on sensations, you describe what you see, and then, of course, you decide on a course of action relative to what you see. Practice, that's the bifurcation I want to make here, theory and practice. One is descriptive, one is experiencing the real world as it really is, and then there's practice, and I would argue that that's basically trying to act well or virtuously based upon your reflections. In philosophy, in the modern period, they kind of separated those two things, theory and practice. One is primarily descriptive of nature and of my place in the world and so forth. And the other is prescriptive about what we should do about it. What is the ought that we encounter when we act in life? Both require thought, but theory, I would suggest, often involves contemplation for its own sake, which can in turn inspire meaningful action. Typically, most of our thought goes into the practical, and less so in the theoretical, but I guess I'm going to make the case for being more consciously aware of your environment, your surroundings, in your place in the world on a regular basis, and then making practical decisions based upon that knowledge, that experience, that sort of conscious, aware interaction with your surroundings. A former colleague of mine, Dr. Cliff Williams, who's now retired, he was at Trinity with me for many years, and then he went over to Wheaton College, and now I think he's still teaching occasionally, but more or less retired. He wrote a book called The Life of the Mind, and really kind of a fun book. It was one thing about Cliff's books; they're all sort of existentially interesting. And by that, I mean he is acutely aware. He's like the quintessential sort of thoughtful person. He sees things, just mundane things, and he thinks about them. Why are they this way and not some other way? And he advocates the intrinsic value of thinking for thinking's sake in this book called The Life of the Mind. That kind of mental engagement. I remember part of the one of the interesting stories in that book, as I recall, it's been a year since I read it, but I remember him sitting on his porch while he was writing the book and observing squirrels and why the squirrels came down the trees when they did, how they interacted with one another, how they planted, or they not planted, but buried nuts and so forth in season, and the various ways they behaved, and he tried to reason why they do what they do, and it was really kind of a fascinating little mini study of squirrels and how to think through what it is you were observing. So that's just one of the things that Cliff Williams talks about in that book. But he makes the case, as I recall, for the intrinsic value of doing it for its own sake. There's a kind of inherent value. I would also argue that there is a really tangible value that I'm going to try to get at with a few stories here today. So what's the takeaway here? Thinking deeply, even about small things, enriches our understanding and connects us with the world. Now, let me give you a couple of stories from my own life. I recognized this very early on, the power of thinking. One of the things I did after my early athletic interests was move in high school in my sophomore year from athletics to the chess team. And there are a lot of reasons for that in my own life. But I will say that for about 2 years of my high school life, chess dominated my thinking. Some of you who are watching this may have an area of life. Maybe it's chess, maybe it's Dungeons and Dragons, maybe it's board games, or maybe it's something else. Maybe it's video games. Maybe it's a world in the video game world that you are caught up into and that you can't wait to get back to, and you develop a certain kind of expertise. Well, that was me in chess. In my junior year, we ended up winning the state championship. And then my senior year, we went on to be, I think it was fifth in the nation. And so I really had 2 years where chess enriched, but also engulfed my entire life. Between my junior and senior year, I rose rapidly within the chess world. And one of the neat things about rising rapidly in the chess world is that your rating typically lags behind your actual ability. I just picked up the game, but I was learning so quickly. My actual skill level always seemed to be about 200 or 300 points higher than my current rating. And so that summer, I made a lot of money in tournaments, just going through class tournaments, winning until I got up into the expert master rankings. And then that's when things got extraordinarily difficult by the time I was a senior in high school. But one of the tournaments where the life of the mind really came to the fore for me was at the Palmer House. It was a class tournament. I think it was either Class B or Class C in that summer. And I was 4-0. I was playing an opponent who was 4-0 in the class tournament. And whoever wins gets to take home the check for first place. And pretty big tournament, lots of players in it. And so it was a prestigious kind of thing. And here I was, probably a little bit better than my rating was, but even so, I was playing a player who was exceedingly good. I remember the game well because some of my friends would come by and watch the game and then, disappear and come back and watch the game because they have long time controls in these big tournaments. It was something like an hour and a half for each player. So the game would go at least 3 hours long. And in this particular game, I was not doing well. I had encountered a player who knew an opening and knew a variation and knew, and probably, frankly, was a little bit more advanced in chess than I was at that time. And he had me so bound up. It was just hard to describe because you can feel first place ebbing away. And I remember the board was kind of locked up, but it was locked up where he had piece play and maneuverability and advantage, and I was just kind of waiting for my demise, I think. And that's when I started really thinking. I said, look, there was one thing about this young brass chess player, brash chess player who didn't think he could be beaten. I said, I've got to find a way to get back in this game. I just don't know what to do. And my friends were looking at the board and they were going, whoo, this is not looking good for old Firestone. Anyway, as I was thinking, time was going and going and going. And I was getting way down on time. So not only was I losing positionally on the board, but I was losing on time as well. And that was, I think, weighing on my psychology as much as anything else, because as your time gets less and less, back in those days, we didn't really have that many digital clocks. In fact, I'm not sure we had any back in the early 80s when I was in high school. But they had these flags on top of the analog clock. And when that clock would go, that flag would rise up. And if it fell, bloop, the game was over. And if you hadn't met time control, you hadn't had enough moves made by that time that flag fell, then you lose. So my clock was going and going and going, and I realized, man, I am losing every which way in this game. But then it dawned on me as I thought it through. He looked like he was getting visibly, psychologically more excited the further my clock went down. In other words, he wasn't as confident over the board as he was with the clock after a certain point. And I was like, wow, I mean, he's got me destroyed on the board. If he just plays the game, I'll lose on time. If he just plays the game, I'll lose over the board. There's no way for me to win. Well, I looked at the board and I examined it, and I realized something about the nature of the way the pieces were set up. If I were to sacrifice my queen, I would certainly lose if he gave it any thought at all. But when I sacrificed my queen, I could follow it up with a knight check. And with that knight check, his king, who was somewhat exposed, would have 3 possible squares to go to. 2 of them win the game easily. One of them was a blunder, because I would slide my rook down, check, and then mate him on the next move. So I thought to myself, hold on a second. You're on the verge of losing. You've got nothing to lose at this point. You have one pathway to victory, and that's a blunder on his part. How are you going to handle this, Firestone? Well, I thought about it, and I thought, you know what? I think I'm just going to let my clock run almost completely out, and then I'll make my moves. And so my flag went, and it went right to the edge of the clock, and I had not yet even made my queen sacrifice. I mean, it was barely holding on, and that's when I reached for my queen, sacrificed it in a piece in front of his king, and then smacked the clock, and the flag stayed up. He was getting visibly excited because I kept seeing him kind of look over at the clock. He's like, game is almost over. I'm almost the champion. He saw my queen sacrifice, And he thought to himself, the guy is just tossing the game. He's desperate. So he takes my queen, smacks the clock really hard. Flag stays up. I throw my knight check in. Hit the clock. Flag still doesn't fall. He is virtually giddy, on the verge of winning a large paycheck. He takes his king and he moves his king and he smacks the clock really hard, wanting the flag to fall. I do a quick rook check. He smacks it again. And this time, the flag falls. Game over. Well, in chess, at least in tournament chess in the 80s, I've noticed that online this rule is no longer in effect, but in tournament chess in the 80s, you cannot lose on time if you have checkmate on the move. It's a rule that I wish chess.com would instantiate in all of its games. In other words, I have played many games on chess.com in the last, year or two, because I've kind of gotten back into chess recently, where I had checkmate on the move and I lost on time. In the old days, that was impossible. The person who had outplayed the other person, who, if they had a checkmate on the move, the clock was irrelevant. Now, you might argue, well, how would the game be over? It would never be over. Well, maybe they should give an extra 5 seconds for the person to move, provided they move into checkmate. Anyway, that's a side note. What was really interesting about the game is I said, no, you didn't win. And he goes, why? Because I have checkmate, which I make the move on the next move. His demeanor fell to the floor because he realized that his jaw is like, what? He had failed to play the game, and rather he played the clock. And he fell into the only checkmate that I could possibly have mustered, given the nature of the game the way it was. My friends came back and they asked me, so Firestone, how'd you do? And they were kind of, I wouldn't say giggling, but they were like, yeah, well, we kind of know how he was doing in that game. I said, yeah, I won. They were just utterly shocked. What did I learn? What was the lesson there? Thinking creatively, strategically, carefully, critically leads to real world success. If that person was a computer, they wouldn't have fallen for the psychological nature of what I was trying to do with the clock there. But they were a human being. I was reading their emotional state, the way they were looking at the clock. They weren't realizing that they had me pretty much under control over the board. Their attention was deflected, and I capitalized it, but I only capitalized it because I was aware. I was thinking. If you do that kind of thinking in life, you can oftentimes get over hurdles that you didn't think, or you weren't even really capable of getting over any other way. I learned that lesson back in high school. When I went to college, I had a sports experience that I think is akin to that experience. I was playing intramural flag football with my dorm team at the University of Illinois. We threw together a team, and we had a lot of fun playing intramural football. But we were struggling. There were a lot of teams, a lot of good teams, and guys who'd played together and stuff. And I'm not sure we even had a victory that season. I don't think we had a victory. But in the particular game that I want to tell you a little bit about, we were down by less than a touchdown. And they play those games based on number, or at least they did, the number of plays. So there was like, say, 20 plays in each half or something like that. There's an official who was keeping count. We were down to our last play. We had about 50 yards to go, last play of the game, and we were down by less than a touchdown. And I decided to adopt a similar lesson to what I learned over the chess board. I said, look, guys, let me quarterback this thing. They were, I wouldn't say defeated, but they were downtrodden because they realized, man, we are in super trouble. If Firestone wants to try, let him quarterback. So I said, look, You guys run down as fast as you can to the end zone. Just run full speed. These guys are running it, rushing in. They're grabbing our flag. They're sacking us. What I'm going to do is I'm going to drop back and I'm going to maneuver a little bit, and I'll buy as much possible time as I can. And I'm going to let it rip and throw it as far as I can. So that's what I did. I dropped back. Their rushers came in, made their way around our blockers. We had a couple of guys running full speed down the field. And I did not have a conscious awareness this is of exactly where they were on the field. I was acutely aware of the fact that the only way we could win is if the ball traveled 50 yards. And I did so before they pulled my flag. And so I dropped back. They were right upon me. I waited as long as I possibly could. He was just about to grab my flag. And I tell you, I whipped the tightest spiral that I've ever thrown. It feels like. I mean, that's probably hyperbolic, but it was a beauty. It just went out. It was a tight spiral. They had 3 guys on the goal line, defending the play, and a buddy of mine named Tony Jones running full speed. The ball is dropping to be intercepted by one of those players right in the middle of the field, 50 yards down, right at the goal line. And Tony Jones, running full speed, runs right in front of him, grabs the ball, and runs into the end zone to win the game. Well, we went absolutely bonkers after that. It was one of our finest moments. We did intramural basketball and other things, but this one, to win an intramural football game against a pretty good team, and get our first victory that way, oh man, you can't beat that. Strategic thinking from chess translated to success in a completely different context. In other words, a conscious, careful awareness of the only possible way forward gave us a chance at victory, and it fell into our laps. A few years later, I had a chance to use similar thinking when I was with my kids as a parent. Now here, we're talking about much further on down the road. I was taking 2 of my youngest, Andrew and Becca, on the Amtrak train down to Arkansas. It's an overnight trip. We got all of our bags put together, and we jumped on the Metro train up in Deerfield, and we were making our way down. We were actually an hour and a half going to land an hour and a half early for our trip. I wanted to make sure we weren't rushed. We had plenty of time, and we were going to be in great shape. It was going to be, I think, about a 1:30 p.m. Train ride overnight, arriving in Melbourne, Arkansas at around 3:30 or 4 a.m. And kids love these kinds of adventures with their dad. But something happened on the way down with the Metro. The train started sputtering, and it died. About, I would say, 2 or 3 miles south of Deerfield. There were other people on that train who were also going to Amtrak, and there were a variety of other people just going to downtown Chicago for the weekend. But we sat there. We must have sat there for an hour, or 30 minutes, an hour. I mean, it was quite the experience. We weren't at a train station, so we were kind of locked into the train. And it began to dawn on me that my hour and a half might not have been sufficient, that maybe I should have given us even more time. But man, who could have realized that? So anyway, the train finally got started again, and it made its way, I think it was into the Glenview train station. And I had a decision to make. Should I get the kids and myself out of the train and jump in an Uber to get to the train station downtown? Or should I just risk it for the biscuit and stay on the train? Well, The train seemed to be running just fine. Our new time was going to be about, I don't know, 30 or 40 minutes early. We got an announcement over the speaker that the train was back up and running and that we would going to be late, but hopefully we're going to be doing just fine. So I made the executive decision. And remember, these kids now, they're like, let's say 10 and 8 years old or something like that. I don't remember the exact ages. We had our backpacks, full backpacks, and we had, our pillows and other stuff that we're going to use on the train. They said, "Okay, Dad, we'll hang in there." When I was in that train station, I went on the Uber app and I noticed that we could get off the train and we could be there on time, without a problem, 30 minutes early. But the train was going to be like 40 minutes early, and so I said, "Let's stick to the train. We're still okay, and we still have the backup plan of Uber if the train has problems further on down the track." Well, you know what's going to happen now. The train, in fact, did have problems further on down the track. I don't think it was another mile or two down. It died again. This time it died right in an intersection with cars, and the doors were closed, and we weren't in a train station. It was like in the middle of a street. I'm like, holy smokes. They said another train was going to come along and push us along to the next train, but there would be some delay and we might have to switch trains. And there was just all sorts of stuff going on. And I'm like, okay, hold it. What do I do now? Now I checked my GPS in my Uber app, and my Uber app was saying, if you jump in an Uber right now, you'll be like 10 minutes early. And I'm like, oh my goodness, we may not have the backup plan available to us. We might be stuck with the train. Well, there was another family who was going for a train ride to across the country, apparently. They were going all the way to California. They had a lot of money invested in their trip, and they're stuck on the train with us. We're all looking at each other when one of the business guys, who's going downtown to Chicago for work, apparently, he goes to the door and he gets his fingers in there. He pries the door open and he says, "Yep, I think it's time to get out of here." And he looks at me, and I remember it like it was yesterday. He says, "This is it. This is your last chance. I let go of this door. You're done." And I look at my kids and I look at my phone, and it tells me that now my Uber ride will be only like 3 minutes early. I said, "Kids, it's time to leave." So he held that door open for us. I jumped out with my backpack and got the kids held the door for us, and we all got out of there. I hit the Uber button and to pick up a ride, and lo and behold, there was backed up cars in all directions because this train was blocking the entire street. But we were on the right side of the train. I mean, I guess it would be the left side of the train, but the correct side of the train for my Uber ride to pick us up out of that mob of cars, to turn around where there's no traffic and to take us. So we ran, I think, about a block with all of our bags and these two little kids running. And there's our Uber. We got in, and I looked at it, and it had us arriving 1 minute early. I said, "Sir, our train is leaving, and it says you're arriving at this time, and when those doors shut on that Amtrak, we'll be heading back home. Can you get us there as quickly as you can?" He said, "Jump in." Well, we jumped in. That guy was amazing. I mean, I don't know if he broke the law. Probably did. He was cutting in and out of traffic somewhat. He made it to the Amtrak station downtown Chicago, and I think we had maybe 1, 2, 3 minutes before the train was set to depart. And I put on that same mentality I learned in the chess world and in the flag football world, that if you have a chance for victory and there's only one pathway, then go down that pathway until you find some roadblock. Maybe the catch isn't made, or maybe the chess player makes the right move and you lose anyway. But what do you have to lose other than barrel forward? Well, I said, "Kids, get your backpacks on. follow me. So we went into that Amtrak station, and they were two little kids, and they were basically right behind me, either holding on to my shirt or just right behind me, and we just kept moving. We got to the Amtrak station, which is a couple, maybe 100 yards, 200 yards down from where you're dropped off. Nobody was in there waiting. Everybody was on the train. They were already loading up another train, so the ticket takers were busy. And I said, look, we have one chance to get on our train, and that's just to walk right past everybody and walk directly to our train and get on it. And we can sort out the details later. So we made our way around a rope through this a secondary waiting area into the train area, and we're making our move toward the train. And that's when my heart nearly dropped, because a ticket taker, a conductor, somebody like that, grabbed my shoulder and he said, "Sir, what do you think you're doing?" And I said, I turned my head and I looked at him. The kids were looking at me. I said, this is maybe lesson number 2. I said, "Sir, that train is my train and we're late and it's going to leave in 1 minute. Can you help me?" He looked at us and he says, "I'm going to get you on that train. Don't do that again." He marched us over to the train, shoved us through the door, basically, got our backpacks on. We got into the train. And just as just as all of us got on, we just barely got on the train, the door shut and the train started moving. It's like, dang, that was pretty special. My kids couldn't believe it. We had an absolutely wonderful trip after that. Stories to tell galore about how this train, this Metro train, nearly cost us our Amtrak train, but how, critical thinking, decisive action, plowing forward, knowing the only possible way for victory, and getting it done. And then at just the right moment, asking a good conductor, to help us out. He could probably see it in my eyes. I didn't, as a dad with 2 young kids, I did not want to go back home, fight with Amtrak to get a second ticket or 3 extra tickets for the next day. We were, I wouldn't say desperate to get on that train, but man, it would be nice to get on that train. I think that guy saw all of that in our faces, and he was willing to help us out with that. So, all of this to say, being conscious, being logical, being critical within the moment, not being passive in your thinking, but being proactive in your thinking can have tangible benefits in the real world. You keep walking forward until you're told to stop. And then when you're told to stop, you ask good people to recognize the situation with you and come on board with you. And good things begin to happen. Okay, well, let me bring this full circle around to philosophy again, because I think philosophy is at work here in some very interesting ways. There's really, broadly speaking, 2 types of thinking or logical thinking. There's the analytic kind of thinking. That's basically the kind of thinking that breaks things down into their component parts. It's based upon the law of non-contradiction. This is something that Aristotle talked a lot about. A thing cannot be and not be at the same time. Clear analytical reasoning. You can't win and lose simultaneously. In all 3 of those cases, I was either going to win or I was going to lose. I was either going to hold up the trophy or I was going to go home with my tail between my legs. Critical thinking understands that and moves forward on the basis of the fact that our intention is to win. Our intention is to get from point A to point B. When I first went to Trinity to teach philosophy, Cliff Williams was tired of teaching logic, so he demanded, in his own sort of very nice Cliff way, that I teach logic. I taught logic for about 20 years or so. Maybe I taught it for all 25 years. But one thing was interesting about the class logic. I never felt as though it was my strongest class. I love the history of ideas more than I like just the sort of technical disciplines. But my students almost universally would report to me that logic was their favorite class. And it's their favorite class, I think, because it put into visual technical language what they were struggling to utter. They understood the importance of logic inherently, but it wasn't until we studied categorical logic of Aristotle, truth functional logic, other forms of informal logic, some symbolic logic, and so forth, that they found what was intuitive to them put into a visual format. And so, logic was a very interesting class to teach. For that reason, students seem to love, especially the better students. There's one thing I learned in logic, at least at Trinity, was that there's kind of three sorts of people with regards to logic. There's the sort of lucid logicians who could potentially even teach the course because it comes so naturally for them. They are excited about logic because it puts into visual, concrete, almost mathematical form what is already intuitive to them. There's also the kind of what I would call learned logicians. These folks are knowledgeable, they're teachable, but logic requires some work on their part and some repetition and so forth to get it. So the class has these ones who are stellar, who are off the charts good in logic. Then there's this middle group that I call the learned. They can learn it and they can do well in the course, but it comes at some effort. It doesn't necessarily come naturally. And then there's the lost. I called the lucid, the learned, and the lost. The lost are the ones who are confused by this sort of thinking. They're like, what? Hold on a second. How does that work? Why does that work? Why does it always work that way? Can't I just sometimes use a logical fallacy and still get from point A to point B? And why is it this way and not some other way, etc.? Those people are always the ones who I'm having to tutor. I'm having to show the light bulb flickers on and off. And sometimes they get it, sometimes they don't. I call them the A, B, and C students right there in a logic class. A, B, and C students. Sometimes those B's can climb to A's, and sometimes the A's don't show up and don't do their work, and they fall to B's and C's. You know how this works if you're a teacher. But in logic, you can kind of quickly see these three sorts of people. Anyway, so that's analytic logic. That's the kind of logic you would get in the North American, Anglo-American context. It's kind of the sort of bread and butter of philosophy. There's another sort of logic. Let me call that synthetic logic. That is a little bit of a higher order thinking, and that is you take basic logic, you're familiar with basic logic, but it involves combining ideas creatively to solve complex problems with higher order thinking. This is where you get into strategies like chess or football strategies. These are these meta strategies. There's some people who can technically find their way forward. There's other people who do it in a more creative way. My son is a special forces operator, and I think an analogy might be your common foot soldier who goes into battle, is on the front lines, has to take the hill, and goes for it and gets the job done. Critical in any kind of military operation to have analytically sophisticated troops who know how to get from point A to point B. Special forces operators, however, say, holy, we have to take that hill? Well, there's at least 5 different ways we could take that hill. What if we took the bridge down the river there? What if we snuck across underneath? What if we did X, Y, and Z and then took it that way? That requires a higher order thinking. That requires complex problem solving and synthetic reasoning. That is taking two opposites and colliding them together to get some kind of higher order synthesis. I would suggest to you that both are fundamental to logic. I'm going to talk more about these later on in the course at some point because I think they're so fundamental to the analytic and synthetic reasoning. And I just mentioned them here because I think they're in play with with this whole question of the importance of being aware, consciously aware of your thinking. Typically, we are analytically describing and analyzing our situation, but if you are consciously aware of excellent and creative ways of getting the job done, you are living at a different level. And this is what I mean by embracing the life of the mind. Trying to utilize every conscious waking moment to think analytically well and synthetically in a higher order. Thinking isn't in this sense just for philosophers. It's a universal tool to enhance human life. Philosophy, if it's done well, teaches us to think and reflect deeply, as seen in Cliff Williams' more mundane examples. Describing squirrel life isn't exactly going to change the world, but it does show you the intrinsic value of thinking, and regular thinking being an important part in the toolbox of any kind of 21st century person. Logic provides the clarity and creativity needed to tackle life's biggest problems. So I would encourage my audience here to embrace the life of the mind. Try to minimize those zombie moments. I honestly think that the critical person can embrace the thoughtless zombie moment. On those 12-hour car rides, if I can vegetate for an hour to get from point A to point B and do so safely and let, my mind and my sort of motor skills, go on autopilot. That can be a good thing, right? It's hard to make some of them long drives. I would recommend a podcast. I would recommend staying alert, but sometimes I could see there being some value, but not if it becomes a way of life where you're a zombie in every and all situations. Challenge yourself to observe, to analyze, and to act thoughtfully in daily life. And when those big moments come up, you'll be ready to seize the day with some good critical creative reasoning. It won't always work. Sometimes you'll try it and you'll find that you're stymied, but you'll be shocked at how often this kind of approach to life really works. So the life of the mind just isn't about solving problems or winning games. It's about living with purpose. It's about living with curiosity and creativity, but it's also about becoming excellent and becoming thoughtful and taking yourself and everyone around you to the next level of living well. All right. Well, that's all I have for you this time. Thanks so much for listening, and thank you for, being a part of the Firestone Files. Write to me if you can. Like it, share it with a friend, and until next time, take care. Bye for now. Thanks for stopping by to spend some time with me here on the Firestone Files. I hope today's reflections offered you some new insights and perspective on life. If you enjoyed the episode or found it valuable, I'd appreciate it if you'd take a moment to like, subscribe, and share it with someone you care about. I'd also love to hear your thoughts. What resonated with you? What challenged you? Or what would you like to hear more about in future episodes? Drop a comment below or send in your suggestions to the email in the description. Your input helps shape where we go next. This has been Dr. Chris Firestone. Until next time, keep asking the big questions. And remember, the kingdom journey is always best with your friends. Further up and further in. Bye for now.